Please stand if you're able for the reading of the Gospel. Text is Matthew 18, verses 15 through 20. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained a brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Matthew 18. Just the reference of the text alone already conjures up images of communities in conflict. You could probably make a verb out of it. I've been Matthew 18. The first 3 verses have been taken by many communities as a justification for exile. And we all know people who've been exiled from their churches, and it's excruciating. My own Quaker tradition even has a little bit of jargon for this. We call it reading somebody out of meeting. We don't do it anymore, thank goodness. But there was a time when we read people out of meeting for going to war, or even for less egregious offenses like marrying a Baptist. Okay, this business of exiling people is tricky, isn't it? It causes a lot of harm. So we have to pay attention to what we're doing when we even look at this passage. Because let's remember, the prophets themselves were exiled, weren't they? Jesus was reviled in his own community. The gospel itself is offensive to those who profit from injustice. So if we're going to be about exiling people, we better be careful, because the person you exile may just turn out to be your best teacher. And yet, the plain reality is that we don't always act from our better angels, and some people are so wounded that they do cause harm, and they actively wound others. So if exile is fraught with possibilities for harm, the failure to deal with conflict at all is equally problematic. So how do we make our way through that dilemma? I suspect that Matthew may have been struggling with the same question. He's trying to protect the Jewish Christian community, and they were under persecution. And so you had to have strict discipline. Matthew knew that probably better than anyone. Yet he's also a writer who wants to convey deep gospel truths. So what does he do? He places these 3 verses about accountability in the midst of some very powerful teachings about forgiveness. Earlier in Matthew, we've got the whole Sermon on the Mount, with its invitation to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. And then immediately following today's text, we have the exhortation to forgive 70 times 7. So Matthew sees the necessity for wise and firm dealings with those who would cause harm, But he goes out of his way to make sure we're grounded in the disciplines of the Spirit while we're doing it. He takes seriously Jesus' call to see with eyes wide open the ways of the world and hearts wide open to the ways of God, and to do both at the same time. This is the central question, I think, for Matthew and for all of us. How do we live deeply into the gospel's call to go forth as sheep among wolves and to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves? How do you hold these two things together? All dove and no serpent is naive. All serpent and no dove is harsh, if not cynical. I wonder if what comes next in this passage can give us a clue. Following these 3 verses, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Why does Jesus say that our earthly binding and loosening is mirrored in heaven? It sounds like an arrangement between the earthly faithful and a God who resides in heaven. But I want to offer a different angle. I want to suggest that we can hear this as a call to begin to notice all the ways in which we internally bind and loosen ourselves and each other and even our political world. What if we were to hear in this teaching that when we bind others, we bind ourselves? When we exile others, we exile ourselves. We become entangled in our binding and exiling. And when we practice disciplines that help us release and loosen the bindings that keep us trapped, something deep within us is also released. We tap deep reservoirs of wisdom and joy. I want to suggest that regular practices of prayer, forgiveness, and opening to the leadings of the Spirit are as critical to our peacemaking as our outward activities. Prayer opens us up to new possibilities. I had to learn this the hard way. Early in my practice, some 30 years ago, I was working in a domestic violence treatment program for men. I came into that work full of ideals. I was going to change the world one violent man at a time. I got nowhere. I was still in clinical supervision at the time, working toward licensure. So I took my concerns to my supervisor, where I complained about my difficult clients. He listened for a while. Then he said, "Dan, there's no such thing as a difficult client." What? They're difficult people, and when they become your clients, then they're difficult clients. I thought he lost his mind. Okay. But then he went on to say, he said, "No, there are no difficult clients. There are only clients who challenge you to go deeper into your own work. You have to figure out how to love these men into their healing. Or maybe you have to love them back to jail. But either way, you can't judge them. They can sense your judgment, and that's getting in the way." Those were not easy words to hear, but I could see that he was right. He helped me to see that there was violence in my judgment, violence in my idealistic Quaker shadow. I was fortunate to have a supervisor who could confront me with love. He earned my trust, and I took his words to heart. I went back to my clients seeing more commonality than difference. They had their form of violence, I had mine. Once I could see that, the work started going a whole lot better. We all have plenty of earth and plenty of heaven within us. We all have our wolves and our sheep, our serpents and our doves. We all have our shadows and our better angels. Jesus calls us to practices that awaken both the inner and the outer world. It isn't just what we do in the world, it's who shows up for the work. We must be clear, worldly and wise, in our efforts to awaken the world to a just mercy and a merciful justice. But we are always wounded healers, and we need communities of safety and trust where we can honestly name our wounds, and where we can count on each other's prayers, and where we can hear the words of forgiveness and mercy that help us unbind our entanglements in the world's serpentine ways. We need each other. I do what I do, knowing that all of you have my back.
Amen.
And I want to have your back.
Amen.
Together, we drink from the wells of mercy.
Yes.
Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I